Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the 6 albums by British rock band Dire Straits. Dire Straits formed in South London in Deptford in 1977 when a couple of guitar playing brothers came down from the north of England in Newcastle. That's Mark and David Knopfler, forming the band with John Ilsley on bass guitar and Pick Withers on drums. They played all the hovels and pubs around London, like we've all done, and gained a reputation very quickly, securing a deal within a year. They went on to make 6 records and sold hundreds of millions of albums. I think Dire Straits are much derided because they seem to symbolise the 80s, and a lot of the things that go along with the 80s, the era of the yuppie, compact disc, corporate rock, stadium rock, all that kind of thing, whatever you want to call it. Dire Straits seem to be the band that epitomises all of that more than any other. But I think that's unfair, because if you go back and explore the catalogue of albums, there's some really wonderful music here, and of course Mark Knopfler is a very, very fine songwriter and guitar player. So let's crack into it. Well, at number 6 from 1979, their second album, Communique. So their first album had really set a sonic template straight out of the box, and had been a very popular album. So they went off to the Bahamas to record this second one. And I just think really this is more of the same but less so. It's a carbon copy of the first album, but it is less interesting. It's less sharp, it's less punchy, there are fewer memorable lyrics and lines. Lady Writer was the single from this album, and it's okay, it's not a bad song, but it's certainly not one of my favourite Dire Straits songs. Once Upon a Time in the West is okay. Where Do You Think You're Going? It's very atmospheric. But it's just less interesting than the first album, and it feels a little bit like Mark Knopfler as a songwriter is in cruise control on this one, and I think the poor reviews reflect its place in the Dire Straits catalogue. At number 5 from 1991, their 6th and final album, On Every Street. The band had split up in 1987. They'd all gone on sabbatical or hiatus, whatever you want to call it. They weren't making music, apart from Mark Knopfler, who was working with the Notting Hillbillies and preparing a solo career, I suspect. Also the lineup changes by this point. It's all become a bit tedious. They were getting in musicians for tours who weren't playing on the album. They were having musicians credited on an album who hadn't really played on it, all that sort of thing. It becomes a bit of a mess, and I'm not going to go into it too much. Suffice to say, the brilliant Jeff Porcaro, of all people, is the drummer on this record. It sold 8 million copies and did quite well over time. It got its reputation over time. But when it first came out, this really didn't make much of an impact. All the singles really didn't dent the charts. You had Calling Elvis, Heavy Fuel, The Bug. They're all not bad songs. They've all got the Dire Straits sounds and the things you'd expect and want in there. Fade to Black, I like that. I think that's a good song. But I think by now the UK audiences just weren't really listening. I think Dire Straits is the downside of Dire Straits' reputation was at its peak at this point, because you had Nirvana coming in, and grunge rock, and Britpop was just over the horizon. All these things really were looking back at corporate 80s rock and just turning their noses up at it. They didn't want it at all, and I'm afraid this Dire Straits record was the victim of that attitude. At number 4 from 1982, their 4th album, Love Over Gold. This was produced by Mark Knopfler himself in New York at the Power Station. And so for this record, they've gone for longer songs. They've gone for more atmosphere, more of an epic feel. We've got Telegraph Road, Private Investigations. They're looking at the epic build here more than these perfect blues pop songs that he can write. It's quite an ambitious, atmospheric album, and it really does take its time getting to everywhere that it's going. It can be very exciting in places, but there is a long musical preamble to all of those points. Industrial Disease was the single from here. Again, it's not one of my favourite Dire Straits songs. It's okay though, I think. Pete Withers had left by this point, replaced by Terry Williams, formerly of Rockpile and Welsh rockers Man. Interestingly enough, Private Dancer, the Tina Turner hit, that was written for this album by Mark Knopfler, but he decided that it would be better off with a female voice, and he gave it to Tina Turner. And number 3 from 1978, their debut album, Dire Straits. So this was recorded in Notting Hill in North London, and by music business legend Muff Winwood, Steve Winwood's brother. And as I said, Mark Knopfler had come down from the north, and he's drawing upon his experiences up north for these songs, but also so you can hear that in songs like Down to the Waterline and In the Gallery, but more importantly, really, he was also drawing on his experience as a pub rocker. And you've got Sultans of Swing, which is, of course, to this day, one of Dire Straits' greatest and most popular songs. He'd been playing in pubs every night, and you can hear every moment of those experiences distilled into that great song. The band already had a bit of a reputation for playing live, but they supported Talking Heads on their UK tour, and it was then that they really started picking up an audience. This album eventually went top 10 in every European country. It went to number 4 in the UK, and it's probably about as raw as Dire Straits can be. 2 guitars, bass and drums, and that's great. I love that. Albums that just stick to the 2 guitars, bass and drums, it's just fine by me. And you can hear the sound immediately. You can hear that Mark Knopfler knows exactly who he is and what he wants to be as a vocalist and as a guitar player and as a songwriter. And he is, by his own admission, a limited vocalist, but he absolutely makes the most of it in the way he crafts his lyrics and works the guitar around his voice. It's really brilliantly done. So at number 2 from 1980, their third album, Making Movies. This was co-produced with another music business legend, Jimmy Iovine, from Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen, Patti Smith, loads of other people. Mark Knopfler wanted Jimmy Iovine in because he'd heard Patti Smith's Because the Night, and also because he was a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, so he thought Jimmy Iovine could add something to the Dire Straits sound, and he really can. This album got a punchier sound. It's got it's slightly more aggressive, maybe, in a way. Having said that, the most popular song on here is the beautiful Romeo and Juliet, which I'm sure you know, which to this day is still an absolute standard in all-time classic rock songs. David Knopfler had left by this point. There was a lot of tension between him and Mark Knopfler. Roy Bittan from the E Street Band is in, adding some more sonic texture on keyboards here. And this was really the beginning of this sort of slightly confusing Spinal Tap-esque sort of who's in, who's out sort of conveyor belt of musicians and session musicians that they sort of got in every now and then. Alan Clark is in on keys as well. Solid rock, Tunnel of Love. These are the sound here has opened up a little bit, and they're using more sonic features. You just listen to the intro to Tunnel of Love, and you can hear that's a great example. Twisting by the Pool was a big song from this one. It was in the UK charts for 5 years. It was fabulously successful. And Rolling Stone put it at number 52 on their 100 best albums of the 80s. It was very, very well received. And there's a one track on here, Les Boys, which I'm a little bit uncomfortable listening to for reasons you can find out for yourself. But number 1, and I think the finest Dire Straits album, is possibly no surprise. But it is 1985's Brothers in Arms, their 5th album. The band, their reputation had been growing with a certain kind of record-buying demographic. And between the previous album and this one, they'd released Alchemy, a double live album, which had been a huge hit critically and commercially for a live album. And so there was a lot of anticipation when this album came out. And of course, it was preceded by Money for Nothing, the huge hit single with Sting on backing vocals, that fantastic guitar riff. and also they'd played it at Live Aid and everything. So Dire Straits really were on top of the world just as this album came out. Funnily enough, to do their Live Aid show, they just had to pop across the car park because they were already doing about something like 10 nights at Wembley Arena that week. So they just had to pop across to Wembley Stadium to do their set. This was co-produced by Mark Knopfler and their engineer on previous albums, Neil Dorfsman. And Terry Williams, the drummer, he was regarded as perhaps not quite having the right sound for this record, so they got Omar Hakim in, who had done a lot of work with Sting on his solo albums, to play drums. And then this album is much more slicker, more produced. It's a more precise sounding record. It was the first album to be recorded entirely digitally because Mark Knopfler was very, very keen to get a perfect sound, and the quality is pristine and precise. It is perfect for the CD age, and I think therein lies one of the problems that Dire Straits had. They absolutely represent the CD age, and that whole idea of kind of things being all surface and no feeling. A lot of people would suggest that Dire Straits music is fantastically wide but perhaps not that deep. I think that's very unfair. I think Mark Knopfler is a very soulful songwriter and a very soulful singer, and of course a magnificent guitar player. The Guardian, newspaper in England, which very appropriately enough for what we're talking about, ranked this CD release at number 38 in the all-time top 50 monumental moments in rock music. So there's some accolade there for you. I mean, it is a terrific album. Money for Nothing, The Beautiful Brothers in Arms, The Man's Too Strong, another great song. There's a couple of moments on here where I find myself kind of losing interest. Your Latest Trick, Ride Across the River. But I think if you just sit yourself back and just let the sort of sonic perfection, as it were, wash over you, then you can just get lost in the sound of this record. You know, especially if you're listening on headphones. It's the 8th best-selling album in UK history, and it's 9 times platinum in the USA. It's gone on to sell 30 million copies worldwide. So it is one of the sort of key, moments in rock album history. And I think when you are looking back on great albums of the 80s, this is absolutely one of the first that you'll go to, along with things like Born in the USA and what's the one I was thinking of? Joshua Tree. Gone out of my head. There you go. I think Brothers in Arms is undeniably a wonderful, wonderful record. You could possibly argue between the top 2 here and maybe even the third. I think the top 3 records here are essential for anyone really, really looking to get into Dire Straits and find out what all the fuss was about. But there you go. There's my 6 Dire Straits albums reviewed and ranked for your pleasure. I don't know many huge Dire Straits fans, so I don't know how passionate you may or may not be. But if I have irritated you, please say so in the comments below and let's discuss it. Until then, I will see you again soon for another Rock Records Reviewed. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.